Welcome to New Thinking for a New World, a Telberg Foundation podcast. I am Alan Stoga, your host. Each week, I bring you conversations with people who think differently about the great issues that are shaping our world. Geopolitics, disruptive tech, mass migration, the changing climate, culture wars, all of it is grist for our mill. I hope you enjoy listening. I also hope you will let me know what you think and that you join the conversation at telbergfoundation.org. And now for today's episode of New Thinking for a New World.
Today, I want to discuss profound changes that seem to be happening in the Middle East. No, not the will they, won't they, the Israelis and the Americans, that is, attack Iran. I think they probably will. Or another lament about how unlikely it is that a Palestinian state will ever exist, although it probably should. Rather, I want to focus on the Arabian Peninsula and the Red Sea area, where a case can be made that elements of a new regional order are beginning to emerge, for better or for worse. I've argued for years that as the great powers withdrew, regional powers would have to work out among themselves a new set of relationships. Saudis, Emiratis, Turks, Egyptians, Israelis, Persians, maybe some others, in no particular combination or order. Made worse by the overhang of religious, political, economic, technological, ideological change and pressure, and also by the reality that the great powers, especially but not only the United States, are still going but not really gone. Witness the Jerry Ford and the Abraham Lincoln sailing around the region to do God knows what, if anything. Specifically, I want to discuss the emerging rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who have gone from allies to collaborators to competitors, and maybe on their way to something else, at least to confront each other, if not maybe even enemies. Why? What's at stake? What could happen? What do they want? How does it matter, and to whom does it matter? I doubt if there are answers, but there surely can be informed speculation. To that end, I've invited Professor Rob Geist Pinfold to speculate with us. Rob is a lecturer in international security at King's College London, a research fellow at the Peace Research Center, Prague, and an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Rob, to New Thinking for a New World.
Thanks, Alan. Pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start at 50,000 feet. Can you frame for us the current state of the Saudi-UAE relationship, strategic, competition, ideological, maybe personal, between the leaders?
Sure, and this is something that analysts have been scrambling to analyze and sort of offer their own take on this since December of last year, when we saw the rivalry explode into the open, particularly in Yemen, with Saudi strikes, airstrikes that is, on Yemeni-backed separatist forces within, UAE-backed forces within Yemen. Now, this really came out of the blue for many observers because Saudi Arabia and the UAE have seemed to be on the same page for so long. They are both led by strongmen leaders. In the UAE, you have Mohammed bin Zayed. In Saudi Arabia, you have, of course, Mohammed bin Salman, who is the crown prince and de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. And these two men seem to share similar regional visions. Both of them were very, very assertive in confronting Islamist movements, like, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood and its many offshoots. And both men were prepared to use force in order to do so, or at least significant coercive measures, like, for example, the blockade, which both those states pioneered against neighboring Qatar from 2017 until 2021. Now, this fallout emerged, as I say, in Yemen, but it was actually symptomatic of a broader malaise, something that had been bubbling under the surface for a very, very long time. Now, if you'll indulge me in dipping into a little bit of political science language, the way we tend to divide states, and yes, this is imperfect, and it's a binary that doesn't always represent world politics, but we tend to divide states into either status quo powers or revisionist powers. Status quo powers think the current balance of power in the region or worldwide works for them, and therefore they want to perpetuate it. They do so by various means. They can use military force, they can use diplomacy, or a mixture of those two tools of statecraft and others. Revisionist powers are very different. Revisionist powers think that for whatever reason, the current balance of power does not favor them. It's not legitimate. It's not in their national interests. And therefore, they tailor their grand strategies to try and change the balance of power to favor them more. Now, the UAE, particularly under Mohammed bin Zayed, is a revisionist power. It's a very, very small state. It has come into its own, I think, lately in terms of its soft power and its hard power. And therefore, it wants to exert a larger-than-life impact and imprint on not just the region, but geopolitics. Saudi Arabia is the complete opposite. It's been a revisionist power, a status quo power for very, very long, because in the Gulf ecosystem, it has long been the hegemon. It's the dominant power. It's much bigger than all the countries around it. It's got a larger GDP. It's got a larger population. And because of that, it's kind of baked into Saudi strategic culture to be a status quo power, because if you are the hegemon, you don't want to change things. Now, all of that went out the window under Mohammed bin Salman, where there seemed to be a strategic convergence between him and Mohammed bin Zayed. Both states became revisionist powers. Now, I'd argue that that was very, very short-lived, and what we're seeing is Saudi Arabia reverting to form. So the whole roots of this crisis is not that the UAE has changed and done things that are previously considered beyond the pale, is that Saudi Arabia changed briefly, but is now reverting to type, and that's the roots of the current crisis.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's pull on that thread for a second. We've watched as Mohammed bin Salman grew as a leader. We watched him with his family coup take power. We watched him grow in a lot of ways and in a lot of grandiose ways. We all of the spending, the fabulous projects. It was like a kid suddenly wakes up on Christmas morning with endless toys. Some of what we may be seeing, I put as a question, is some of what we're seeing him maturing and understanding a bit more about power, about his own kingdom, about the threats that are quite real to him, his and his country.
I think there's a lot made here of personalities that, as you say, that MBS suddenly did all these huge things, these dramatic reforms, both internally and externally, and now all of a sudden he's changing. Yes, he's changing, and yes, he's maturing, but you could also argue that he's basically been, I guess, absorbed by Saudi heuristics, or, if you're in the West and you're a conspiracy theorist, you call it the deep state. And, I don't want to give any of that traction, but it's the tremendous power of path dependency. This is what we see all the time in geopolitics. Why do states do the same thing over and over again? Why do different administrations pursue similar policies? Because largely they see the world in the same way. They're influenced by history, by their strategic culture, by their biases, which are unconscious. And that's exactly what happened to Mohammed bin Salman, I would argue. He did flirt with revisionism, but it backfired significantly for him. And therefore, Saudi Arabia is now reverting to type. We saw, for example, that intervention in Yemen. It did not go well for the Saudis, it's fair to say. Saudi Arabia was targeted. Its armed forces over-relied on air power, for example. And as a result, Mohammed bin Salman did not get the results that he wanted. So he pivoted pretty quickly to being a status quo power, which is probably what many individuals in the Saudi bureaucracy wanted him to do for quite some time.
On the other hand, you have the UAE, which under the leadership of MBZ has transformed itself. I remember the first time I was there back in the late 70s, it wasn't quite what Singapore was 50 years ago, but it wasn't much different. Today, it is Shangri-La. And that has been importantly under his leadership. So it's understandable that he doesn't want to go back to the little fishing village mentality. He is a regional player, if not a global player. So you've got the new kid on the block, to use non-academic framing, that has its own interests, has charted its own path, and doesn't want to return to the notion that the hegemon is actually in Riyadh, not in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Alan. And the UAE's transformation really has been incredible. You alluded to it there, but traditionally, the sort of liberal state in the Gulf, where a lot of which had a lot more soft power than other Gulf states, was Bahrain, right? Now these days, the UAE's GDP is 10 times that of Bahrain, despite the fact that they have similar numbers of citizens. UAE just over 1 million, Bahrain just under 1 million. So that transformation is really extremely impressive from a pure statecraft or grand strategic perspective here. But for the Saudis, it's also a cause for concern, because several decades ago, when we'd be talking about the Gulf, we'd be talking about Saudi Arabia. In terms of traction in European capitals, in DC, it was the Saudis that were calling the shots. Other countries more or less deferred to the Saudis. And we've seen a diversification in regional power and centers of power in the region. And that's not just the UAE. We've also seen the rise of Qatar, for example, who have had a difficult relationship, not just with Saudi Arabia, but also with the UAE as well. So Saudi Arabia's hegemony is being challenged and has been challenged for quite some time. And it is now trying to sort of navigate those mucky and murky waters. The impressive thing that the UAE managed to do is to tilt Saudi statecraft and Saudi grand strategy more towards their revisionist vision. And you mentioned this is all these impressive achievements are under MBZ. I'm going to use my English pronunciation here of MBZ if you're an American. This is under MBZ, who came to power more or less in 2014 when his half-brother had a stroke, so he became the power behind the throne. Same thing happened with MBS. He came to power as defense minister in 2015, but now holds a lot more power behind the scenes. So these two guys really sought to. There was a clear strategic convergence, but it was also for the UAE a source of what in political science we call derivative power, where a small state or a middle power manages to have a larger than life influence or input in world affairs, mainly by shaping the statecraft of a larger power. So, a lot of the time people focus on the US-Israel relationship, for example, but here you had a dynamic where the UAE was really shaping Saudi Arabia's statecraft. And for someone like MBS and for Saudis, that was actually kind of humiliating. To use a crude analogy, imagine if you were in the States and there was a more or less universal feeling that it was Canada that was calling the shots and telling you what to do and guiding any sort of US administration. So this was humiliating, but it was also a problem for the Saudis, given that Saudi has historically been a status quo power.
So those are the two players. Let's do two things. On the one hand, I want to talk about two key relationships for both of them. And on the other hand, the three arenas in which they're competing: Yemen, Sudan, and Ethiopia. But let's start with the relationships, because clearly the two, in some way, I'm leaving Iran out of this for a while, the two most important relationships in terms of that competition are with the United States on the one hand and with Israel on the other hand. And arguably, there's a direct competition for Trump's favor. You could probably do a balance sheet showing who's paid how much for what. And then separately, there's the Israeli thing where the Saudis, as you know, were on a path towards a relationship, an explicit above-board relationship until Gaza. The Emiratis are there and have continued to deepen that relationship in really profound ways despite Gaza. So let's talk about the U.S. and first. How do you see that competition for favor and for favors between the two?
Well, coming at this from a US perspective, this is exactly the problem with this, America First vision, or this grand strategic vision of the US retrenching itself and basically letting its regional allies, whom it trusts, run the show. what do you do when your regional allies have very, very different visions of what the region should look like and how to get there? And obviously this also is Israel is the elephant in the room when it comes to this, but also Saudi Arabia and the UAE and then other countries too, like Turkey or Qatar, for example. So the US wants to disengage and let these guys run the show, but then when they're actually competing with each other, it's a recipe for dragging the US back in, actually. And obviously the US has a potential role to play here as a mediator, for example, between its different partners. But the problem is when they start competing in other states. So, you mentioned the obvious points of contention like Yemen, for example, like Sudan. But if you look at countries like Bahrain and Egypt, policymakers there are looking at this deepening UAE-Saudi split with significant pessimism and worry, simply because these states have and are reliant on Saudi and UAE money and aid and support. They do not want to have to choose between one or the other. They don't want to have to bite the hand that feeds to keep the other hand feeding them. So this is where this becomes a real US national security interest, because if you have the funds dry up for countries like Egypt and Bahrain, who are both, by the way, major US non-NATO allies, if those funds dry up, then that means either the American taxpayer has to step in or someone else has to step in, or if they don't, that exacerbates the risk of instability and internal conflict and indeed state failure and collapse, which again is a recipe for the US to get dragged back in. So what the US needs to do is get involved, but in a non-traditional sense. It has a job to play here as a mediator. The Saudis and the UAE have cooperated in the past, even when they disagreed. When it comes to countries like Sudan, for example, we need to get back to that paradigm of, I guess, what you could call, if you're using buzzwords, cooperative coexistence. And I think that's where the US has a role to play here in managing the tensions. It's unlikely we're going to see a rapprochement anytime soon, but there has to be clear lines of agreement in terms of what's legitimate and illegitimate competition, what are the legitimate and illegitimate spheres of influence, and how to prevent this division from destabilizing the region and dragging the US back in.
Do you know leaders who, regardless of where they live or what they do, are changing the world? Leaders who are not content with what is and are working hard for what could be. Leaders with both a demonstrated track record and the potential for continued impact. Leaders whose work is innovative, courageous, rooted in universal values, and global in approach or implication. If so, please nominate them for the Telberg SNF Eliasson Global Leadership Prize at telbergprize.org. I would agree with all that, but color me profoundly skeptical that it is within the current administration's capacity to either understand or execute what you so well articulated. Let's flip to the Israelis.
Yeah.
Clearly, you've got, as you said, a similar situation in that the Israelis have an amazing relationship with this administration, get most of what they want when they want it. They have a deep, mostly under the waterline relationship with the UAE that has, if anything, intensified during the last year and a half. Whereas the Saudi relationship, which was on a path, seems to have at least slowed down, if not completely stalled out.
Definitely.
But given all of the regional instability that we're about to talk about, that relationship with Israel is critical in terms of managing both the bilateral Saudi-Emirati relationship, but also the region. What the Israelis do regionally obviously matters, and with whom they're in sync or not in sync matter. How do you see the Saudis and the Emiratis competing for Israeli favor? Or do you?
Well, hindsight is a wonderful thing, right? When we look back at Israel and the UAE normalizing relations in 2020, some analysts said, okay, well, this is kind of a trial balloon. The Saudis are allowing this to happen because they want to see how this dynamic unfolds. Looking back at it, this was actually one of the first cracks, or very visible cracks, in the UAE-Saudi relationship, right? The Saudis have actually been pretty consistent when it comes to Israel. They've said, we will normalize relations with Israel, but it's conditional. Israel has to agree to either a two-state solution or take some steps towards Palestinian statehood. There was a degree of, I guess, loosening under Mohammed bin Salman, but they were still expecting Israel to do something. The UAE ditched that conditional approach, right? They went ahead and said, actually, we will normalize relations with Israel in 2020 to stop Israel from annexing the West Bank. That was all, the public equation. And there was all sorts of talk in Israel that, okay, this is going to start a new wave. When will Saudi Arabia join the Abraham Accords? And this is when I kept saying to the Israelis, you do not understand the Saudis, okay? The Israelis, the Saudis will never join the Abraham Accords. If they're ever going to normalize relations with Israel, it will be an agreement with a different name that has Saudi flags and Saudi imagery all over it as something that's fundamentally different to the UAE deal, right? And that shows you the competition between both sides. And one of the interesting dynamics here is that the Saudis feel like the Emiratis forced their hand, because obviously to fly from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi, you have to fly over Saudi airspace. The Saudis were not keen to let that happen, but they felt like they were unable to stand up, or unwilling to stand up against the Trump administration, given the importance it placed in the Abraham Accords. And to add insult to injury to the Saudis, you then saw Bahrain, which is traditionally a Saudi ally, then agreed to normalize relations, which shows you the growing role of the UAE in Bahrain, and how this country has potential to be a flashpoint for that deepening rivalry. So this is kind of the dynamic here. When it comes to the UAE and Israel, there's also an interesting dynamic taking place. I'd argue that, going back to that poli-sci language, that Israel was traditionally a status quo power, okay? They had a qualitative military edge, and they used that qualitative military edge to protect the regional status quo. If that meant tolerating Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, so be it. This was, there was this feeling that quiet is better than instability. The October 7th attacks was such a traumatic and indeed strategic shock for Israeli policymakers and the Israeli public that Israel ditched all of those assumptions. And I would argue that Israel is now a revisionist power, using its qualitative military edge not to restore quiet, but to even remake the region. So actually, this brings it much closer to the Emirati worldview. And I don't think it's a coincidence that academics have when they talk about the UAE, they describe it as Little Sparta. And Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, he himself referred to Israel as another Sparta. So we're seeing these, and I think that analogy is crude for various reasons, and I don't think it fits either of those countries.
And I'm not sure it's fair to Sparta, but that's a different point.
Indeed, right. But what you're seeing here is the UAE and Israel having that strategic convergence. They not only have a similar worldview and a vision for the region, but also a view of how to get there by using military force to confront hostile threats, be that Iran or other groups in the axis of resistance, and to remake the region. Now, this is, I guess, the opposite of catnip for the Saudis. To the Saudis, this is instability. This is a recipe for chaos. This is a recipe for disaster. This imperils their transformative Vision 2030. You can't attract investors if the whole region around you is on fire, for example. And also, as I say, Saudi Arabia has a long-established tradition of being a status quo power. They even reached a détente with Iran, brokered by China, by the way, in 2023. So they do not have the appetite for regional transformation. The Israelis and the Emiratis do.
So let's play that forward. There are at least three, not counting Iran, not counting Gaza and the West Bank, there are three centers of crisis at the moment: Yemen, Sudan, Ethiopia. The Saudis and the Emiratis are actively playing against each other in all three, with intensifying ferocity, really close to direct confrontation. Probably has been some direct confrontation, in fact. You argued earlier that, yep, that's happening, and that is a signal for the Americans, for example, or someone to come in and say, hey, we need to find some stability here. If that doesn't happen, how do you see these confrontations playing forward? Because what's happening is exactly what you already identified. The locals don't want to see happen, which is having to choose one side or the other. So we've got the Egyptians lining up, not surprised with the Saudis, apparently the Turks, although I can't quite tell what the game the Turks are playing. You've got others aligning themselves, usually the source of challenge. We see it in Sudan, we see it in Ethiopia, lining up with the Emiratis, with the Israelis, not sort of there, but not visibly there.
And the recognition of Somaliland by Israel, right?
The recognition by Somaliland was one of those. It was one of those things that shouldn't have surprised anyone, because it had nothing to do with Israel and Somaliland. It had everything to do with this larger competition.
Indeed.
So, given all that, we are slip sliding, it seems, into potential chaos. And that's without the Iranians and whatever the hell the Americans are doing with Iran, which is beyond our scope at the moment.
Yeah, the recipe for chaos is there. And, you mentioned those fronts where there has been a long-standing rivalry. As I say, Sudan, the UAE and the Saudis have been backing different parties there for a long time now, but have managed to more or less manage their rivalry and limit it to that front. But we're seeing the potential for chaos elsewhere. Just to give you an example, look at Syria, for instance. When you had the fall of the Assad regime in December of 2024, the Gulf states were the first, along with the Turks, to place a vote of confidence in the new regime, to pressure the West, particularly the US, but also the EU, to lift sanctions on the new government in Syria, and also to pour money into rebuilding and investing in Syria. And it seemed like for a long time, like all the Gulf states, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, as well as Turkey, were all singing from the same hymn sheet here. They all had the same goal of basically reorienting Syria away from the Iranian-led axis of resistance. And the way to do so, they saw it as by strengthening the new regime and legitimizing the new regime. Now, with the UAE, we've seen some interesting moves in a different direction. It actually looks like there's strategic convergence between Israel and the UAE. Now, Israel has not demonstrated a clear vote of confidence in the al-Shara regime, I think it's fair to say. When the regime came into power, Israel saw that as, I guess, a opportunity to occupy more territory, what was previously a demilitarized zone, also to carry out an unprecedented number of strikes against former Assad regime weaponry. Now, they justified this saying, look, we don't know what's happening. This is all a temporary measure. But as time went by, Israel has settled into this new revisionist paradigm. This is where we're seeing, Israel's revisionist grand strategy and the shift from being a status quo power to a revisionist power, in that Israel is quite happy to challenge borders. It's happy to use its qualitative military edge. It would rather basically exert its authority over large parts of Syria than come to an agreement with the regime that it could then be accused of breaking. If it were, and it would then require it to limit its operational military freedom. Now, the UAE are interestingly aligning with Israel a lot more in Suwaida, in southern Syria. Now, Suwaida is a province where there was some horrible sectarian violence between local Arab Bedouins and Druze, the Druze minority group. Now, there is a very, very powerful Druze lobby in Israel. The Druze are relatively integrated for non-Jewish citizens of Israel. And as a result, Israel has kind of recast itself in very sort of post 9/11 humanitarian intervention, language, as the protector of the Druze and other minority groups in Syria. So what we saw in July last year, when the Syrian regime tried to exert its influence in Suwaida and to subdue the sectarian violence, we saw Israel bomb the defense ministry in Damascus. And now we're hearing about the UAE and Israel working together to arm and fund sectarian Druze secessionist groups in southern Syria. So this is a huge shift. And I think that this really is emblematic of how this Gulf conflict can get out of hand. We go from the Gulf states really agreeing that, this is how we rebuild Syria. This is how we prevent an Iranian resurgence. And now we see that divergence between the UAE and the other Gulf states. And this is incredibly bad news, I would argue, for regional stability and great news for powers like Iran. If we have all these different actors who have a shared traditional hostility to Iran, turning their guns on each other, maybe not literally yet, it gives Iran the opportunity it needs, the essential breather to restock, rebuild, and reassert itself. So this is, again, where I think the US should play a pivotal role in saying, okay, you guys might disagree on issues X, Y, Z, but when it comes to Iran, we need you to agree, and we need to have a framework here of agreeing collectively how we deal with Iran and its attempt to reassert itself.
We don't, unfortunately, have time to go to Iran, but one could then take what you just said and imagine that if Iran is kept in the state of chaos, internal chaos it's in, if there is civil war in Iran, if there is continual unrest, that's in the interest of the revisionist powers, because they don't have to worry about Iran. They can worry about each other, which is where I want to go with my final question. Can you imagine a world that there's two possibilities here, broadly and simply? One, at some point, MBZ and MBS stand up and say, we can do better. We can figure out some way to have a new approach to this region. Or two, they end up, perhaps through proxies, maybe directly, in growing confrontation, which is it's even less in the Saudi interest than in the Emirati interest, but arguably it's in neither's interest. Which of those two, it may be too early to answer this question, but if you had to, where would you place your money for the next year, 2 years?
I think for the next year, we're going to see the relationship getting messier and nastier, but I will temper that with a degree of optimism that I think in the long term things can and will get better, simply because Gulf states are, their ability to change their statecraft, their vision, is incredible. They are very, very versatile actors. Now we talk about the UAE going after the Muslim Brotherhood. It didn't make the Muslim Brotherhood illegal until 2014, and there were indeed many Muslim Brotherhood affiliated members of Emirati administrations before then. And also look at Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Saudi Arabia and Qatar are getting on better than they have done for a very, very long time, possibly ever. It wasn't that long ago that Saudi Arabia blockaded Qatar from 2017 to 2021. And there was even rumors that the Saudis were going to, send troops into Qatar to bomb the studios of Al Jazeera, for example, none of which happened, partly because the Americans played a pivotal role in saying, okay, we might support your blockade, but don't get carried away. Don't go too far. And that was the Trump administration and Rex Tillerson, by the way. So there is potential here to rein this in. I don't think it's in anyone's interest for this rivalry to escalate. And it's not even in Israel's interest for this rivalry to escalate. Remember that at the end of the day, one of the reasons why the Israelis were so happy about the Abraham Accords was because they wrongly, but they did see it as a route to normalize relations with Saudi. Saudi Arabia is still, the main prize. I remember a lot of my friends in the Gulf were disgusted when the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, said that Saudis should basically go and ride camels, use some sort of racist language to describe them, saying, we're not going to give you anything. You can normalize with us, but don't expect anything. And they were outraged by his racism. And I said, I'm unfortunately desensitized to his racism because Bezalel Smotrich says horrible things about various minority groups more or less every month. What was interesting was he was forced to apologize. He retracted his statement. And I think that illustrates that the Israelis, even under this far-right government, still want relations with the Saudis. Saudi Arabia for them is the ultimate prize. So they want to use the UAE to get to Saudi Arabia. They don't want to insert themselves into this very nasty divide and then take a side. They are at risk of doing so, but I think that has the ability to change. And of course, it's not in the US's interest. The only state whose interest this rivalry is in is Iran. Because this gives Iran the breathing room. It gives them the ability to rebuild, to reassert themselves. It means that other states take their eye off the ball. The US takes their eye off the ball. So even if in the short term things are going to get worse, my optimistic take, and granted optimism doesn't go very far in the Middle East, but allow me a degree of optimism. My optimistic take is that in the long run, this is in no one's interest for it to continue except for Iran, and therefore it will be reined in. We might not see the two sides agree to everything and share a regional vision, but what I call cooperative coexistence is not just possible, but also likely.
Rob, thank you very much, both for the conversation and for ending on an up note. I'm not sure if it's optimistic or hopeful, but it is an up note, and we certainly need more of those. This conversation has to continue sometime sooner rather than later. Thank you again.
Thank you. My pleasure, Alan.
Thank you for listening to this episode of New Thinking for a New World. I'm Alan Stoga, podcast host, and I look forward to your joining our next conversation. Remember, tell us what you think at telbergfoundation.org.